Why does your mind rush to explain the moment something hurts, as if pain must mean something? Strangely, the deeper it hurts, the harder your mind searches, yet the answers never seem to settle anything. So what if the search itself is the problem? And what if the meaning you're looking for is the thing keeping the pain alive? There's a quiet habit your mind has developed over time, and it doesn't feel like a habit at all. It feels automatic, almost necessary. Something happens. A conversation shifts, a message goes unanswered, a look feels different than it used to. And before the feeling even fully lands, your mind is already moving. Not toward the feeling itself, but toward explaining it. It doesn't wait. It doesn't pause. It starts building a story, not because it wants to understand the truth, but because it cannot tolerate the absence of one. And that's where something subtle begins to unfold, something most people don't notice. The mind isn't searching for meaning because it's curious. It's searching because it's uncomfortable. But that's not the part people usually question, because on the surface, it looks intelligent. It looks like reflection. You replay the moment, analyze the tone, reconstruct the situation from every possible angle. You call it thinking. You call it awareness. But underneath that, something else is happening quietly. You're trying to close something that refuses to close. And that's where it starts to shift, because pain, in its raw form, is unfinished. It doesn't come with an explanation attached to it. It just exists, unclear, undefined, unresolved. And the mind has a very specific reaction to that kind of openness. It treats it like a threat. Not because pain is dangerous, but because uncertainty is. So instead of staying with the feeling, the mind moves away from it by trying to define it. It starts asking questions that feel important, but are actually attempts to escape the discomfort of not knowing. Why did this happen? What does it say about me? What does it mean about them? Where is this going? And each question feels like progress. But something strange happens the deeper you go. The more you search, the less stable everything feels, because the mind doesn't stop at one explanation. It generates multiple versions, each one slightly different, each one carrying a different emotional weight. In one version, you're at fault. In another, they are. In one version, it was intentional. In another, it wasn't. And instead of clarity, you get layers. And that's where the quiet tension begins to build. Because now you're not just feeling pain, you're navigating possibilities. And each possibility carries its own emotional consequence. One thought creates guilt, another creates anger, another creates doubt. And suddenly, the original moment is no longer the center of your experience. The interpretation is, but that's not the real reason it feels exhausting. What most people don't realize is that the mind isn't trying to find the correct meaning. It's trying to find a stable one, something it can hold on to, something that stops the movement, because movement feels like instability, and instability feels like loss of control. So the mind keeps searching, not because it believes the next thought will be true, but because it hopes the next thought will finally feel certain. And when it doesn't, it continues. And that's where something even quieter begins to take shape. You start to believe that understanding is the same as relief. That if you can just explain it clearly enough, define it precisely enough, the feeling will resolve itself. But instead, something else happens. The feeling becomes tied to the explanation. So now, every time the thought returns, the feeling returns with it. And that's where the loop forms, because the mind doesn't just revisit the moment, it reinforces it. It replays it with new interpretations, new angles, new emotional tones. And each time it feels slightly different but never finished. And the strange part is, it feels like you're doing something important, like you're working through it. But the more you engage, the more the moment expands, not in reality, but in your internal space. And that expansion doesn't feel like growth. It feels like pressure. Because now the pain isn't just a moment that happened, it's a structure you're maintaining, a narrative that keeps updating itself. And every time you try to finalize it, something doesn't align. A detail doesn't fit. A memory feels inconsistent. A new thought contradicts the last one. And instead of resolving, it reopens. But that's still not the part that causes the deepest tension, because beneath all of this, there's something even more subtle. The mind isn't just searching for meaning in the situation, it's searching for meaning in you. And that changes everything, because now the question isn't just what happened, it becomes, what does this say about me? And that question doesn't have a clear boundary. It expands beyond the moment, beyond the person, beyond the situation. It starts connecting to past experiences, to previous doubts, to older versions of yourself that never fully resolved. And suddenly, this one moment begins to feel heavier than it should. Not because of what it is, but because of what it connects to. And that's where the experience becomes difficult to step out of. Because you're no longer just processing something recent, you're interacting with a pattern that has been building quietly over time. A pattern where every painful moment becomes an opportunity to search, define, and ultimately question something deeper. But the more you do that, the less separate each moment feels. They start blending. And that blending creates something that feels continuous, like the pain never really ends. It just changes form. And that's where the mind begins to lose something it doesn't even realize it had. The ability to let something exist without turning it into a conclusion. Because once everything needs a meaning, nothing is allowed to simply pass. And that's where the weight comes from. Not from the moment itself, but from the insistence that it must become something. But that still leaves a question that most people don't stop to ask. Why does the mind feel so compelled to turn pain into meaning in the first place? And what is it actually trying to protect you from when it does that? If this content speaks the words you can't explain, click subscribe. Thank you for your support. There's a point where the search stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a reflex you didn't agree to. You don't decide to look for meaning anymore. It begins before you even notice the feeling itself, almost like your mind has learned that pain should never arrive alone. It must be accompanied by an explanation. And that's where something quietly reshapes your entire experience. Because now, pain is no longer just something you feel. It's something you immediately try to solve. And that changes the way it exists inside you. It becomes active, moving, unfinished. Not because it actually is, but because you've trained yourself to treat it that way. But that's not the real shift. The real shift happens when the search itself becomes more familiar than the feeling. At some point, the mind stops recognizing pain as something to sit with and starts recognizing it as something to investigate. And once that happens, something very subtle is lost. The ability to experience something without interfering with it. Because interference starts to feel like control, and control feels safer than stillness. So instead of allowing the feeling to move naturally, you interrupt it. Not aggressively, not intentionally, but consistently. You insert thoughts into it, questions into it, interpretations into it. And each one feels like progress. But something else is happening at the same time. You're preventing the feeling from completing itself. And that's where it starts to become cyclical. Because a feeling that isn't allowed to complete doesn't disappear. It stays open, waiting. And the mind interprets that openness as something unresolved, something that still needs attention. So it returns to it, again and again. not because the feeling is strong, but because it was never allowed to finish. And that creates a very specific kind of confusion, because now it feels like the pain is persistent. But what's actually persistent is the interruption. And that's the part most people don't realize. They think they're stuck in the feeling, when they're actually stuck in the pattern of engaging with it. And that pattern is subtle enough to feel invisible. It hides behind logic, behind reflection, behind the belief that understanding is always necessary. But sometimes, understanding is just a way of staying connected to something you don't know how to release. And that's where it becomes uncomfortable to admit. Because if the search isn't helping, then why does it feel so difficult to stop? That's where the deeper layer begins. The mind doesn't just search for meaning to resolve pain. It searches to prevent something else from happening. Something quieter, something less defined, something that feels more threatening than confusion. Emptiness, not the dramatic kind, not the kind people talk about openly, but a very subtle absence. The absence of direction, the absence of explanation, the absence of something to hold on to. Because without meaning, there is nothing to organize the experience around, and that feels unstable. So the mind builds meaning not to clarify the moment, but to stabilize itself within it. It creates structure where there is none. It assigns intention where there may not be any. It builds conclusions not because they are accurate, but because they are solid, and solidity feels safe, even if it's wrong. And that's where the pattern becomes difficult to break. Because now, meaning is no longer about truth. It's about comfort. And once meaning becomes a source of comfort, the mind will defend it. It will return to it. It will reinforce it. Even when it keeps the pain alive. Even when it prevents the experience from settling, because the alternative is to sit in something that has no clear edges, and that feels like losing control. But that's not the part people struggle with the most. What really unsettles people is what happens when the search slows down, when the mind doesn't immediately fill the space with explanations, when the questions pause, when the need to define softens, even slightly. There's a moment there, very brief, almost easy to miss, where nothing is being explained, and the feeling is just there, unlabeled, unresolved, uncontained. And instead of relief, it feels unfamiliar. Because for so long, the mind has been moving around the feeling, shaping it, controlling it. And now, there's nothing to do. No direction, no interpretation, no conclusion, just presence. And that's where something unexpected appears. Not clarity, not closure, but a kind of quiet discomfort that doesn't come from the pain itself, but from the lack of movement around it, because the mind has learned to associate stillness with vulnerability. If it's not analyzing, it's exposed. If it's not explaining, it's unprotected. And that belief runs deeper than most people realize. It's not about the moment. It's about what the mind has learned over time. That meaning equals safety. And without it, something feels unfinished. But that belief carries a cost, because every time you turn pain into meaning, you're also turning it into something that stays, something that has to be revisited, maintained, reinforced. And slowly, without noticing, you begin to live less in direct experience and more inside interpretations of it. And interpretations don't fade the way experiences do. They linger, they repeat, they evolve. And that's where the weight accumulates. Not from what happened, but from everything built around it. But this leads to something even more difficult to face. If the mind keeps searching, not to understand, but to avoid something deeper, then what exactly is it avoiding? And why does letting go of meaning feel more unsettling than holding on to the pain itself? because that's where the real conflict begins to reveal itself. There's a part of this that doesn't look like a problem at all, and that's exactly why it stays, because from the outside, it looks like awareness. It looks like depth. It even feels like responsibility, like you're trying to understand things instead of ignoring them. But underneath that, something far less comfortable is taking place. The mind isn't just searching for meaning, it's resisting exposure. Not exposure to other people, but to something internal that has no clear shape, something that can't be explained, fixed, or even properly identified. And that's where the real tension begins. Because when meaning disappears, even briefly, you're left with something that feels unfinished in a way that can't be resolved through thinking. And that lack of resolution feels like a kind of internal vulnerability most people don't have a language for. So the mind replaces it, not with truth, but with structure. And once that structure is in place, something subtle happens. You begin to relate to the experience through the structure, not through the experience itself. You don't feel the moment directly anymore. You feel what you've decided it means. But that's not the most destabilizing part. The real shift happens when the structure starts to define you. Because once the mind asks, "What does this mean about me?" it doesn't stop at the moment. It begins forming conclusions that feel broader, more permanent. And those conclusions don't just explain the situation. They begin to reshape your identity around it, quietly, without announcing themselves. And that's where the internal conflict starts to deepen. Because now, you're not just dealing with a painful moment, you're dealing with what that moment seems to confirm. And confirmation feels heavier than confusion. It feels more final, more personal, even if it's incomplete. But that's still not the root of it. What most people don't realize is that the mind doesn't fear pain as much as it fears ambiguity about the self. Pain can be endured, it can be tolerated, even ignored. But ambiguity, especially about who you are, where you stand, or how you're perceived, that's harder to contain. So the mind rushes to define it. Not because the definition is accurate, but because it removes the ambiguity. And that removal feels like stability, even when it creates something else entirely. Because now, instead of sitting with a moment that doesn't make sense, you're holding on to a version of yourself that may not even be real, and that version becomes something you carry forward into future interactions, into new situations, quietly influencing how you interpret everything else. And that's where the pattern begins to extend beyond a single moment. Because once meaning attaches to identity, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads. A small doubt becomes a lens. A brief uncertainty becomes a reference point. And suddenly, new experiences are no longer neutral. They're filtered through something that was never fully resolved to begin with. But here's where it becomes difficult to recognize. Because the mind doesn't present this as distortion. It presents it as continuity. It feels consistent, logical, even necessary. Like you're learning something about yourself, something that needs to be acknowledged. But that's not what's actually happening. You're not discovering something stable. You're reinforcing something unfinished. And that unfinished quality is what keeps it active, because anything that feels unresolved demands attention. And attention, in this case, takes the form of more searching, more interpreting, more defining. And each time you engage with it, the structure becomes stronger, not because it's true, but because it's repeated. And repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity feels convincing, even when it's built on something unstable. But that's still not the most difficult part. The most difficult part is what this pattern slowly removes from your experience. The ability to encounter something without immediately turning it into something about you. Because once everything becomes reflective, Nothing is allowed to remain separate. Every moment becomes personal. Every shift becomes significant. Every interaction becomes something to decode. And that creates a kind of quiet pressure that doesn't feel obvious at first. But it builds. Because now there's no neutral space left. No experience that doesn't require interpretation. No feeling that doesn't demand explanation. And over time, that constant engagement becomes exhausting. Not physically, but internally. Because the mind is never at rest. It's always adjusting, refining, updating the meaning, trying to stabilize something that was never meant to be stabilized in the first place. And that's where something begins to fracture. Not dramatically, but gradually. Because the more you rely on meaning to define your experience, the less you trust the experience itself. And that creates a gap, a distance between what you feel and what you believe about what you feel. And that distance is subtle, but it changes everything. Because now you're no longer directly connected to the moment. You're connected to your interpretation of it. And interpretations are never complete. They always leave something out. Something unaccounted for, something that doesn't fit neatly into the explanation, and that something doesn't disappear. It lingers, quietly, and that lingering becomes another source of tension, because even when you think you've understood the moment, something still feels slightly off, slightly unresolved, slightly open. And instead of questioning the interpretation, the mind doubles down. It searches more, refines more, adds more layers, but the feeling doesn't settle. And that's where frustration begins to build. Not just with the situation, but with yourself. Because now it feels like you should be able to figure it out. Like the answer is there, just slightly out of reach. And that belief keeps the cycle moving, because as long as you think there is a final meaning to discover, you'll keep searching for it. But that search never completes. Not because you're missing something, but because the thing you're searching for doesn't exist in the way you expect it to. And that realization is where the discomfort starts to deepen. Because if there is no final meaning, then what exactly have you been trying to reach this whole time? And what happens if the mind isn't trying to solve the pain, but trying to avoid something even more difficult to face? Something that isn't about the situation at all, but about the absence of something you've come to depend on without realizing it. At a certain point, this pattern stops belonging to a single moment and begins shaping the way you relate to everything, not in a dramatic or obvious way, but in a quiet shift that changes how experience is processed before it even has time to settle. The mind no longer waits for pain to begin searching. It assumes there must already be something hidden underneath, something that needs to be uncovered, even when nothing has fully formed yet, and that assumption alone starts to distort the experience before it even becomes clear. What makes this difficult to notice is that it doesn't feel like anticipation. It feels like awareness, as if you're simply being attentive, reading between the lines, noticing what others might miss. But in reality, something else is happening beneath that surface. You're not just observing what is there, you're projecting what could be there, and that projection quietly reshapes the moment into something heavier than it actually is. A pause in conversation no longer remains a pause. It becomes a question. A slight shift in tone stops being neutral and starts carrying implication. A delay begins to suggest possibility. None of these things are inherently painful, yet the act of searching assigns them weight. And once weight is assigned, attention naturally follows. And attention, when sustained, begins to generate more material, more angles, more interpretations, until the original moment becomes surrounded by layers that were never part of it to begin with. This is where the boundary begins to blur, not completely, but enough that simplicity starts to feel unreliable. When something appears simple, the mind doesn't accept it at face value. It assumes something has been missed, something deeper must exist, something not yet uncovered, and that assumption keeps the process alive. The search continues, not because there is something to find, but because the mind has learned to distrust anything that doesn't immediately offer depth. But the deeper consequence of this pattern is not just overthinking, it's instability. The more meanings you create, the less stable any single one becomes. Each interpretation introduces a new possibility, and each possibility slightly weakens the certainty of the previous one. Instead of arriving at clarity, you begin to move between perspectives, shifting from one explanation to another, each one temporarily convincing but never fully settling. Over time, this creates a kind of internal inconsistency that is difficult to define. Nothing feels completely grounded, not the situation, not your understanding of it, not even your emotional response. Everything feels slightly conditional, as if it depends on which interpretation is currently active, and that subtle instability becomes exhausting in a way that isn't immediately obvious. It's not the pain itself that drains you, but the constant need to reposition yourself within it. What makes this pattern even more difficult to step out of is that it has slowly taken on a protective role. The mind has learned that meaning creates distance, and distance feels safer than direct exposure. But the exposure it's avoiding isn't the situation itself. It's what remains when there is no structure to hold on to. When interpretations are removed, even briefly, what's left is something far less defined, something open, uncontained, and without direction, and that openness feels like vulnerability. Not the kind that can be explained or resolved, but the kind that simply exists without offering anything back. There is no clear answer inside it, no conclusion to arrive at, no stable version of yourself to anchor to in that moment. And that absence creates a subtle but persistent discomfort. The mind experiences it as a gap, something incomplete, something that needs to be filled. And so it responds in the only way it has learned, by generating meaning as quickly as possible. But here is where the contradiction becomes unavoidable. The very thing the mind uses to create stability is also what prevents stability from ever forming. Because meanings are not fixed, they shift, they evolve, they contradict each other depending on your state, your memory, your perspective, and that constant movement creates the instability the mind is trying to escape from. Yet it doesn't recognize this, because it remains focused on the next explanation, the next possibility that might finally feel solid. And that pursuit never reaches an endpoint. There is always another angle, another interpretation, another version that promises to resolve what the last one could not. Each one offers a sense of temporary closure, but that closure doesn't hold. And when it fades, the process begins again, often with more intensity than before, because now there is more material to work with, more layers, more connections, more weight. Gradually, something important begins to erode, almost without being noticed. The ability to trust moments that do not require explanation starts to weaken. Simplicity begins to feel incomplete, almost suspicious, as if something must be missing, and that suspicion creates distance from the moment itself. You no longer experience things as they are. You experience them as something that must be understood before it can be accepted, and that condition quietly alters your entire relationship with reality. But beneath all of this, there is a deeper question that rarely surfaces clearly. If the mind depends on meaning to feel stable, then what happens in moments where meaning does not exist? What does it reveal about your relationship with yourself when there is nothing to define, nothing to conclude, nothing to hold on to? Because those moments do not just challenge the situation, They challenge the mechanism you have been using to feel grounded. And letting go of that mechanism does not feel like relief. It feels like losing something essential, even if that something is what has been sustaining the cycle all along. And that is where the conflict reaches its quiet peak, because now the question is no longer about solving the pain, but about whether you can remain present in an experience that offers you no structure at all, and what might still exist within you if you stop trying to turn every moment into something it was never meant to become. If the pattern has been built around turning every painful moment into something defined, then stepping out of it doesn't begin with finding a better explanation. It begins with noticing the moment before the explanation forms, not stopping the mind, not forcing silence, just recognizing the exact point where the movement starts. Because that moment is usually missed. The feeling appears, and almost instantly, the mind begins shaping it into something, labeling it, connecting it, preparing it to become part of a larger structure. But if you slow that down, even slightly, something different becomes visible. Not the meaning, but the impulse to create one. And that distinction changes the entire experience. Because once you can see the impulse, you're no longer inside it in the same way. It's subtle. It doesn't feel powerful. In fact, it feels almost insignificant at first. But this is where the shift actually begins. Not in controlling thoughts, but in recognizing that they are attempts to stabilize something that was never meant to be stabilized. And that realization removes a kind of pressure that usually goes unnoticed. The pressure to resolve. Because most of the tension doesn't come from the feeling itself. It comes from the expectation that it must lead somewhere, that it must reveal something, that it must become part of a conclusion about you, about the situation, about what comes next. But when that expectation softens, the experience starts to change in a way that isn't dramatic, but is very real. The feeling becomes smaller. Not because it's suppressed, but because it's no longer being expanded through interpretation. And that's where something begins to return quietly. Space. Not emptiness in the sense of absence, but space in the sense of allowing something to exist without immediately surrounding it with meaning. And in that space, something unexpected happens. The feeling starts to move on its own. Not because you made it move, but because you stopped interrupting it. This is the part that often feels unfamiliar at first. Because it goes against the habit that has been built over time, the habit of engaging, analyzing, defining. Letting something exist without doing anything to it can feel passive, even uncomfortable. But that discomfort isn't coming from the feeling. It's coming from the lack of control around it. And that's important to notice, because it reveals something that isn't obvious at the surface. The difficulty was never the pain itself. It was the inability to leave it untouched. And once that becomes clear, the approach naturally begins to shift. Not into avoidance, not into suppression, but into a different kind of attention. An attention that doesn't try to turn the moment into something else. One that allows the experience to remain as it is, even if it feels incomplete. And that incompleteness is where something new begins to form. Not meaning, but tolerance. The ability to remain present without needing to resolve what is present. And that might seem small, but it changes the direction entirely. Because once you stop demanding that every moment become something defined, the mind no longer needs to rush. The urgency fades. The constant searching softens. And what's left is something quieter. A kind of direct contact with the experience that doesn't require explanation to exist. But this doesn't mean the mind will suddenly stop creating meaning. It won't. The habit doesn't disappear just because you've seen it once. It will return. It will try to rebuild the structure. It will offer explanations that feel convincing, interpretations that seem necessary. And that's where the shift becomes practical, because now, instead of following those explanations automatically, you can pause, not to reject them, but to decide whether they are needed. And most of the time, they aren't. Not because understanding is useless, but because not every moment requires it. Some experiences don't need to become part of a narrative. They don't need to define anything. They don't need to lead anywhere. They can exist and pass. And that passing is something the mind has been interrupting without realizing it. So the shift isn't about finding a final meaning. It's about allowing moments to remain incomplete without trying to complete them. And that changes the role of the mind entirely. It stops being something that constantly organizes your experience and becomes something that can observe it without interfering. But this leads to a deeper question. If you no longer rely on meaning to stabilize your experience, then what holds you steady when nothing is being explained? Because that's where the final shift begins to reveal itself, not in the absence of thought, but in the presence of something that doesn't need thought to exist. What holds you steady is not another explanation. It's something far less noticeable, and because of that, it's often overlooked. It's the simple fact that experience continues, even when you stop defining it. The moment doesn't collapse. The feeling doesn't become dangerous. Nothing actually breaks when meaning is absent, and that realization doesn't arrive as a sudden insight. It appears quietly, through repetition, through moments where you choose not to interfere and notice that everything still moves on its own. At first, this feels unfamiliar, almost like you're doing something wrong. The mind expects engagement. It expects you to respond, to analyze, to turn the moment into something structured. So when you don't, it produces a kind of subtle tension, as if something important is being ignored. But if you stay there, without reacting to that tension, something begins to shift. You start to see that the tension itself is part of the pattern, not a signal that something needs to be solved. And this is where the change becomes real, not in theory, but in experience. Because instead of following the tension into another chain of thoughts, you allow it to exist without direction. You let the questions remain unanswered, not because you've found better answers, but because you've stopped assuming they are necessary. And when that assumption fades, the mind begins to lose its urgency. It still produces thoughts, still offers interpretations, but they no longer carry the same weight. They feel optional. That word matters more than it seems. Optional. Because for a long time, meaning didn't feel optional. It felt required, as if every feeling had to be processed, every moment had to be understood, every discomfort had to lead somewhere. But when you start to see that meaning is something the mind creates, not something every experience demands, the relationship changes. You're no longer dependent on it to feel stable, and stability begins to come from somewhere else. Not from certainty, not from conclusions, but from a kind of quiet consistency in your presence. The ability to remain with something without needing to transform it. The ability to experience something without needing to extract something from it. This doesn't remove pain. It changes its behavior. Because pain that isn't constantly interpreted doesn't expand in the same way. It doesn't attach itself to identity. It doesn't spread across different areas of your experience. It remains where it is, as a moment, as a sensation, as something that can move through rather than something that has to be carried forward. And that movement is subtle. It doesn't feel like release. It feels like less resistance. Like something is no longer being held in place. But this is also where patience becomes necessary, not as effort, but as allowance. The pattern won't disappear immediately. There will be moments where the mind pulls you back into interpretation, where the need to define returns strongly, where the absence of meaning feels uncomfortable again. And in those moments, nothing has gone wrong. It's just the habit continuing. And the shift is simply this: noticing it without immediately following it. Again and again. Not perfectly. Not completely. Just enough to create small gaps where experience is allowed to exist without being turned into something else. Over time, those gaps become more familiar, and familiarity reduces resistance. You begin to trust that not everything needs to be resolved, that not every feeling requires a conclusion, that not every moment is a reflection of something deeper about you. And that trust doesn't feel dramatic. It feels quiet, almost unremarkable. But it changes something fundamental. Because once you stop trying to turn every experience into meaning, something else becomes possible. You begin to encounter moments as they are, without immediately positioning yourself inside them, without turning them into something personal, something symbolic, something that needs to be understood before it can be allowed. And in that space, something very different emerges. Not clarity in the usual sense, but a kind of lightness. Not because everything makes sense, but because it doesn't have to. And that might be the part that feels the most unfamiliar. That nothing is missing when nothing is explained. That the moment is not incomplete just because it hasn't been defined. And once that becomes real, even slightly, the need to search begins to lose its intensity. Not because you've found the answer, but because you no longer need one in the same way. And that changes how everything moves from there.